Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to you all to this special Bible as History, where we're looking at some questions and answers. Now, you may have seen over the past few months, we've been doing these Bible as History videos, where we've been looking at evidence for some of the things that we find in the Bible, and finding out that we can prove that these things are true, and we can show that, yes, from the Bible, but also from sources outside the Bible as well. So today we have some questions which we're going to try and answer on that subject of biblical evidence for things. And so I'm joined once again by Dale and Phil. Welcome to you both. It's good to have us all three here today so that we can discuss these things together. So let me say we've got three questions, and they are all linked, I think, in the sense that they're all asking for evidence for certain things and why we might think certain things to be the case. So I'll start with the first question, which is this: why do people still consider the Bible to be history when it's full of erroneous stories? So maybe Dale might like just to kick us off on this.
Yeah, that's interesting. It would be helpful to define the term. I mean, that word means wrong or incorrect. Now, do they mean stories that the stories in the Bible are not historically true? Do they mean they're too much of a fairy story and that means they're not true? Or do they mean the Bible contradicts other historical documents, for example? I mean, the short answer is, I think, is that there is historical evidence for the events we see in the entire Bible. I think we do have evidence that Jesus existed. I know a lot of people may not agree if they're skeptical about the divine side of him, etc. But certainly there is evidence that a physical man named Jesus existed. We know that for a fact that Babylonian exiles happened. We know for a fact Assyrian exiles happened. And we know that there was a departure, an exodus from Egypt. I mean, a lot of people may disagree with the amount of numbers there were or the spectacular miracles, but, you know, we have documents from Egyptian sources that show that the Bible was written at a certain time in a certain context, and it testifies to the history that it's talking about. I think perhaps the prejudice in a question like that is people get uncomfortable when you start bringing God into the equation, because now you have to start talking about, you know, miraculous things like Jonah being swallowed in a fish or Jesus rising from the dead. It seems to be those kind of things that people attack.
So what you're saying really is the fact that, yes, people will accept that those events happened, but it's the miraculous side of them that they're considering to be erroneous. These things, as far as they're concerned, can't possibly have happened. Phil, what would you say to that?
I think most people, when they talk about erroneous things happening in the Bible, I think they usually point, or they are pointing to the Old Testament. I mean, Dale have already mentioned like Jonah, but there seems to be, you know, many things in the Old Testament that they think is not true. But again, you know, I think archaeology and history have proven the opposite. I think in many ways, archaeology have proven the Bible not to be erroneous, but the dead opposite. I think archaeology, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, has showed the Bible to be very accurate. So I'm a little bit uneasy with this idea that the Bible is erroneous, because I really don't understand what they mean by that. You know, I think Dale have just pointed out some of the reasons why they think that way. But on the whole, I think what archaeology have done, I think, has proven the Bible to be immensely accurate in many areas. Let me just mention something like Ur of the Chaldees, for example. For years, people thought that was a made-up place, never existed. And yet in the 19th and 20th century, we discovered it, and we found many other things there as well. Another thing was Nineveh. well, that was a made-up place. That was erroneous in the eyes of many people. And yet, in the 19th century, yet again, archaeologists discovered it, and not just discovered Nineveh, but they discovered many of the palaces of many of the kings as well, and unearthed a lot of cuneiform writing. So I think that question itself, the Bible is full of erroneous ideas. I think that question is a little bit misleading. I think it should be the other way. So I think the Bible is true in many areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're saying really is this, that we can trust the Bible on these historical stories.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, if we can trust the Bible to be historically true in that sense, we can also trust the Bible when it tells us about God and what he is like. Because if we can find archaeological evidence for the events of the Bible, then that proves the Bible is telling the truth about those. And so when the Bible then tells us about God and about Jesus and what he came to do, we can then also trust the Bible for that as well.
Yes. One more story very quickly, the story of Joshua when he assassinated the king Jabin or Jabin. There is actually a cuneiform tablet with Jabin's name on it. So again, historical outside evidence proving that the Bible coincides with these historical timelines fits perfectly, I think.
Now, we also have a specific question, because we've talked about historical evidence, the events of the Bible. But somebody has also asked, is there any historical evidence for Moses? Now, Moses, as we know, is somebody who is mentioned in the books of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and those books of the Bible talk about Moses and his life. But was there really a figure called Moses, or was he just somebody who is mythical? Because some people would say there's no historical evidence for Moses at all. That's just made up. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'll try and kick off if I can. Really, there would be two sides of this answer. And one would be that the other writers in the New Testament and the Old Testament, for that matter, reference him. I mean, Jesus says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? Now, if Jesus said Moses was real, he has taken an awful lot on that reality. So that's the first thing we would have to consider, that Jesus considered Moses to be real. Now, a lot of people may want to dismiss that because we're answering the Bible from the Bible. I think a lot of people in that question want nitty-gritty evidence, as I would call it. There's a very interesting verse in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, where Stephen actually says Moses was taught all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in both speech and action. Now, that word action there is very interesting. And in fact, in the book of Exodus, we only have Moses from when he was a baby, and then when he was into an adult before he killed the Egyptian. Josephus actually accounts for those missing 30 years, and he says that Moses was actually a general in the Egyptian army, and Egypt conquered Ethiopia. And that's what Stephen might be referring to there when it says he was mighty in words and in action. So we have, again, another historical reference talking about Moses outside the Bible. There was a very famous statue that was discovered, which it was in the Ramesses area in Egypt by the Nile. And they discovered this statue, and it was actually the statue of Joseph. They know that because on the back of the statue were remains of paint, multi-stripes from a multicolored coat. And the statue was depicted in an Egyptian way, the way they depicted Israelites. Now, what's interesting about that tomb was discovered and the statue was there. Now, some of you may know the story, in Genesis 50, verse 26, it says, so Joseph died being 110 years old, and then they put him in a coffin in Egypt. And then we have a very interesting passage then in Exodus, and that says that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him to the promised land. Now, Interestingly enough, when they discovered that tomb, those bones were not there. Again, we have another reference, for, talking about historical reality, and that Moses was the person who took those bones. And then one more, I'll try and be as quick as I can on this one also. Moses witnessed the Ten Commandments, the actual law. And you have to consider that before this, everyone in the Egyptian areas used hieroglyphics. The Ten Commandments were given in Hebrew. So right in the Egyptian area there, we have the birth of a language. And Moses was the person who came at the exact right time to bring the Ten Commandments. This was the first time in history God had communicated in an alphabetical form to his people. So to me, those outside references is plenty of evidence that, on top of Jesus's claims that Moses was a historical person. And in Deuteronomy, he talks in first-person narrative. I did this, I did that. So we have plenty of evidence, I think, that Moses existed and wrote the Torah.
Yeah, so Moses really was a person. He wasn't just a mythical figure that appeared in a story that was told throughout the generations as we would consider fairy stories. He really was a real person, and there is historical evidence that he really was. And I think that the fact that, as we said, Jesus took him so seriously is another important point. And if you think of when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, it was Elijah and Moses that were the two representatives from the Old Testament that witnessed there. I don't believe that Jesus would have a mythical figure there to try and witness to him. It will be somebody who really was one of the former prophets. I don't know whether you've got anything to add, Phil.
I mean, Dale have already mentioned Josephus. If you look at his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus actually writes page after page after page on Moses, and you certainly don't get the idea of a mythical figure in his writing. And Josephus was a very good historian, and many people, ancient and now, have always regarded him as a top-class historian. And what I liked about Josephus's writing is the fact, and Dale alluded to it earlier on, that he in fact was the leader of an army of Egyptians that led the army against the Ethiopians and married a princess of Ethiopia. Now, the Bible doesn't mention that, but there again, it didn't need to mention that. That could have been for political reasons. But this is what Josephus writes. Now, if Josephus was writing a fable, why on earth would he put all that stuff in? So I think he writes about Moses very much like he would write about Elijah or any other Old Testament figure as a person of historical value. The other thing I was going to say was the fact that even in the Quran, even Muslims mention Moses and the name of Musa. And the name really means Mo in Egyptian, by the way, simply means river. And Uza, it means being brought out of. So it means being brought out of the river. That's what Moses means. Now, Moses is an Egyptian name. It's not a Hebrew name, it's an Egyptian name. So all of this, when you weigh it all up, I think all the evidence points to a real historical person. I suppose you could say, why would anybody want to make it up? I really don't know. Because all what we read, if you want to read it in the Quran, in Josephus, in the Bible, it all seems to be talking about a real historical person who lived in historical time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Phil and Dale, for that. And of course, one of the most well-known events in the life of Moses, and one of the most important things that he did, was to actually bring the people of Israel out of Egypt. They were living in Egypt under slavery, and God used Moses to rescue them. And that brings us to our third question, because That asks about the number of Israelites that there were. Because if you read Exodus, Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, tells us that there were 600,000 men, not to mention women and children, who left that night from Egypt. Now, if you think about it, there were 600,000 men. When you take women and children as well, that means that there were over 2 million people who left Egypt that night. And the question is it actually possible that that number is real? Could there possibly have been as many as 2 million people leaving that night? Because how could 2 million people, because they then were living in the desert for the next 40 years, could 2 million people survive together in the desert in that way? Could all their animals survive in the desert? Would there be enough pasture for them all? So that's a question that we were asked. What about that number, 600,000? What do we make of that? Is that accurate, or is it not?
Yes, we have Exodus 12:37. I would also add on top of that, we have in Numbers chapter 1, God tells Moses to create a census of all the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in Numbers chapter 1, verse 46, we're also told that that number totals to 603,550. Now, the Hebrew word there is Elif. We spell it in English E-L-E-F. That word always refers to 1,000. So it's no coincidence that when the Bible calculates those numbers, it is giving you accurate mathematical answers. Now, some people attempt to translate Elif to mean clang or unit or group. And what they've done is they say, it's 600 clangs, not people. And of course, that is an attempt to reduce the number of people in the Exodus, place the sea crossing in a local, smaller body of water, and remove the supernatural and explain it by scientific terms. Now, if we go by a literal reading of Numbers and Exodus, we are talking about literally 2.3 million people walking through the desert and the wilderness. Now, I would just want to say that in answering this question, we need to account for the very fact that the Red Sea was not the only miracle in this event. We have water from a rock. We have God raining down manna from heaven. The Exodus story is miracle after miracle. So, if we believe in a God who is big, he can certainly sustain people for 40 years in the wilderness. Now, the point was brought up about animals. I think this is another misunderstanding, because people hear the word desert and they just think of sand, dry land. Remember, we're talking about the Sinai Peninsula. When they left Egypt, they go from Sinai, across the Gulf of Aqaba, and then into Saudi Arabia. Well, we know from today, it rains there. If you go there a certain time of the year, it rains abundantly, and there is pasture there. I mean, what does Psalm 68 verse 7 say? When you, God, went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth shook, the heavens poured down rain. You gave abundant showers, O God. You refreshed the weary inheritance. God, you provided for the poor. We have account after account that God can look after 2 million people very easily in the wilderness. And then very quickly talking about the animals, we're not talking about Welsh sheep here who need green pastures. It's believed that one of the species of sheep was Jacob's sheep, which originate from the Middle East area there. And, scientifically, they can go a long time without water, 3 or 4 days under emergency conditions. And they can also go very skinny. They can travel hundreds of miles with people, because then you can fatten the animal up once you get there. So, I really don't see how the animals are going to be a problem. They're going to follow the people. These people were fit. They work 7 days a week. It's believed they got to the sea crossing within a week to 10 days after leaving Egypt, traveling day and night. The pillar of cloud would be another miracle. If the people can do it, the sheep can do it. You know, we just come back that we believe in a God who is big, who can do anything.
Absolutely. And we've already seen in Exodus the way that God brought all those terrible plagues upon Egypt. I mean, God showed his power in a mighty way there with all those terrible things that happened, and the way that he looked after his own people at the same time. And if we have a God who can do those things, then God surely can look after 2 million plus people and animals in the desert. There's no reason why not, is there? Bill?
Well, I think the miraculous is the essential part of the story, of the Moses story. I think if you take that away, it would have been impossible for these people. If there was no God, it would have been impossible. There's no way they would have survived. So the whole wilderness story is based upon the miraculous. I think that goes without question. And remember, when these people were in the wilderness, all they ever did was grumble.
Yeah.
Because all they could see the hardship. Oh, look what Moses have done. He's brought us into this wilderness. We were far better off when we were in Egypt. Which is strange, really, because they were being suppressed and being treated in a wicked manner in Egypt, and yet they were complaining that it would have been far better to be in Egypt than out in the wilderness. So doesn't it prove one thing, that without God, it would have been impossible? But I think Dale, like already mentioned, God supplied food with the manna and quail. He brought water, and I think it was something in the question about, the mud that would have caused, by this horrendous rain. Well, that wouldn't have been a real problem. If there's muck, you just wait for it to dry up. I mean, it's hot enough to dry. So it wouldn't have been a problem. The animals, as Dale has said, wouldn't have been a problem. It would have been a problem if it wasn't for the miraculous. So the whole story is all about the greatness of God. How he brought them through this 40 years of what would have been a very difficult time. And I think as for the rest of the story, I think it's just a real practical story of how life would be, in these conditions. So all down to the miraculous. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And, it just goes to show that we can trust the Bible when it says these things. We can trust the Bible when it says there were 600,000 men. We can also trust the Bible, incidentally, on that same subject, because we're told that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. Now, there have been questions about that chronology as well, haven't there? That, was it really 430 years? Surely they weren't there that long, were they? Well, in actual fact, that 430 doesn't refer to the amount of time that the Israelite people were in Egypt. That 430 years goes right back to Abraham. If you remember, in Genesis, Abraham spent time in Egypt, and that was 430 years before the Exodus. And so there had been Israelites in Egypt for 430 years, because Abraham went there. Isaac went as well, didn't he, I think? So, there were these things as well that happened. And then, of course, the famous story was then of Joseph being taken to Egypt, and that's how there were so many of them. But from Joseph onward was about 215 years, something like that. But some people say, oh, that can't be true, and the Bible can't be true, the number's not true. Yes, they are true, because we have to realize what the 430 was referring to. It was referring to time back from Abraham. So once again, we can trust these numbers to be true, can't we?
Yeah. And also, I would just say, every Egyptologist, whether they account for God or not, will all testify that there is, archaeological evidence for not only a mass migration of people leaving Egypt, but also coming in. Exodus 1, they grew so greatly that it got Pharaoh scared. We have tombs with donkeys buried in them. That was not an Egyptian practice. We have daggers that look different to the Egyptians. We have Assyrian houses that are Assyrian style, not Egyptian architecture. And the fact that when the Joseph statue was discovered, there were 12 tombs. 12 tombs, why would there be 12? So every Egyptologist will testify to this account. And I just, when God tells us about a number, we know that God can tell time, that God knows, when Israel goes into Babylon for 70 years, he means 70 years,
Yeah.
And of course, many people probably for decades have argued that you don't find the name Israel anywhere in Egypt hieroglyphics until they discovered what's known as the Benekfa stele. This was a stele that was discovered, and it goes back, I think, to roughly between 1213 BCE, and the word Israel is mentioned on there. So, the more you dig in to the historical and archaeological evidence, the more everything comes to light. And it begins to show that the Bible is a very accurate document on what took place at that particular time. So there's nothing erroneous about it. If you want to know about the history, well, okay, the Bible doesn't give us everything, but what it does give us is real, true historical narratives. And I think that's all we need. It's all we need. We can trust it. We can really trust it.
Absolutely. I think that's been the big thing that's come over this afternoon, our discussion about this. And that is that we can trust the Bible completely. When it says that a certain thing happened, we can trust that it happened. And as we said earlier, we can also trust God because the Bible tells us about God. And we can trust that God wants to have a relationship with us. God sent Jesus into this world for us. And we can trust what the Bible tells us about that as well. And so for you who are watching this today, we just hope and pray that you will come to know something of the love of God in your life, and you'll see the reality of God. Yes, the historical reality, and the fact that God can be a reality in your life if you put your trust in him. So thank you to Dale and to Phil for being with us this afternoon. We trust you've enjoyed our little talk this afternoon. There'll be another Bible is History in a month's time. Please look out for that. In the meantime, on Sunday afternoons, our regular Sunday at 4 series will be continuing. Well, thank you very much for watching. May the Lord bless you all.